Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's build video, I'm putting together Dante's Devil Sword from Devil May Cry. Now, those that follow my Instagram know that I built this in just a few days, and the reason I was working at warp speed was I had to take it down to Dragon Con so my buddy Jason could do one of his dream cosplays as Dante. Now, the thing that's absolutely fantastic about this sword is even though it's 62 inches in length, because it's made all out of my HD foam and foam clay, it only weighs 2.5 pounds. Now, if you would like to make your own, I do have free PDF files available over on my website that you can download to build right along with the video. But I will warn you that even though the template does cover the basic shapes, you're gonna have to get good at organic sanding and sculpting. So I want to show you what it takes to put Dante's sword together. Let's go ahead and get started. The template for this sword is massive, and to keep the sword rigid, I'm going to be inserting a 3/4 inch poplar dowel down the middle. The upper section of the template can be removed because I don't need it right now. The main body of the blade is going to be fabricated using some 10mm HD foam. Using some 1, 2, 3 blocks to weigh down my template, I can trace around it using a pencil. To make sure that both halves of the blade are the same, I'm going to rough cut around my marking. I'm then going to trace around this to get the other side. This can then be cut away from the remainder of the foam. Making sure to wear my respirator, I'm going to be using some weldwood contact cement to put the two halves together. The adhesive is going to be generously applied to the foam using a chip brush and then left to dry. Once the contact cement has become tacky, I'll put a bead of super glue along the perimeter, and then I can put the two halves together. With the two halves sandwiched together, I can now trim away the excess foam, giving me the exact shape of the blade. I go ahead and mark on the foam exactly where the wooden dowel is going to be inserted down the middle. I even make a little 3/4 inch spacer so I don't have any excess room on the sides. With my lines drawn onto the foam, I can now remove the material from the middle of the blade. And I decided to go ahead and check for fit before I glue the entire thing together. Using more contact cement, the adhesive could then be brushed onto the dowel, as well as the interior cut of the sword. After the adhesive had become tacky, the foam can then be firmly pressed against the wooden dowel. And this is the perfect lightweight way of making the sword rigid. With the dowel in place, I can now address the bevels on the sides of the blade. I mark them off with some masking tape as a visual reference, and I'm going to sand the edges down using my rotary tool. A sanding sponge can then be used to clean up my edges, and now my sword has bevels on either side. Part B is going to make up the main detail section of the sword. Just like the blade, this is also going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam, making sure to mirror it for the opposite side. Then comes the time-consuming and arduous task of cutting around each one of these spikes, but I promise in the end it's all going to be worth it. With the main body of Part B cut out, I can now separate the individual sections. These are going to be traced onto the cutouts for all 4 pieces. The lines give me a guide to follow as I start to identify the individual sections using my rotary tool. I thought it'd be easier to do this now while it's all connected rather than trying to keep track of each one of these individual pieces. With these 4 sections sanded, I can now lightly heat seal the foam before moving on. Now, the whole point of separating these pieces individually is that in the end they are going to overlap, so I can take each one of these pieces and separate the individual sections using a utility knife. Now, I do keep them in order so I don't get confused when gluing them to the blade. So it's time to start applying these pieces at the top. And notice that when I'm gluing this down, I start at the outside, but I leave the inside sections propped up. This will allow me to insert the opposite side and have them overlap. And then it's just the process of moving down the blade back and forth, one overlapping another. Now if you end up having gaps in the middle and you can still see that wooden dowel, it's not an issue. I'm going to be filling these gaps with foam clay later on so that it looks seamless. And again, I will say that keeping these pieces in order definitely helps. It really allowed me to move quickly back and forth down the blade. And if some of the overlaps aren't perfect, it doesn't really matter because it's supposed to look organic anyway. Moving back to the top of the blade, I use some adhesive to glue the sections that are sticking out together. And just like the middle of the blade, any gaps that I have here will be filled with foam clay later on. Now I can look and see exactly how my template lines up with the rest of the blade. I'm going to remove part of the template and not include the handle. This piece is going to be transferred onto some 10mm foam, and just like the blade, I'm going to rough cut and tack 2 of them together. After the pieces have been cut out and separated, I can then glue them to the top of the sword. Now notice here that I have some gaps on either side. Luckily for me, some of the offcut while making the blade is the perfect size. So I'm going to rough cut these foam pieces and then glue them in to fill the gaps. Then any additional foam that's sticking out on the sides I can then trace with my pencil and then cut away. And again, seams don't matter because a lot of foam clay is going to be used to texture this piece as well. To bulk out the size of the handle, I'm going to spiral wrap the dowel using some 6mm foam. I wrap it around the dowel as tight as I can, but again, this is also going to be covered with foam clay and additional foam strips later on. Now I can start to texture the sections that I've attached to the sword. Using the very edge of my sanding drum on the rotary tool, I'm going to try to mimic the textures that I've already applied to the other pieces. This will also give me the opportunity to sand down the outside edges and contour those shapes. It's now time to start working on the top of the handle, and I create a custom template for the jewel, which is going to be on the PDF as Part C. Like I've done several times in this video already, I'm going to be stacking more 10mm foam. This time 3 pieces of 10mm foam will give me the correct thickness for the jewel. With the pieces glued together, I could then cut them out all at once. Then I could go and slice away sections of this piece to give the jewel the facets. To secure the jewel to the dowel, I'm going to pin it into place. This will consist of drilling out the dowel and the jewel using a 1/4-inch bit. That way I can insert a 1/4-inch dowel into the handle. That way with the remaining dowel I can add some adhesive and insert it into the jewel. For the foam that's going to wrap around the outside of the jewel, I'm going to start with part D, which is going to be traced and cut out of some 6mm foam. And notice at the top of the jewel it tapers in so that these sections will slightly bend inward. To make it look as though the textured part of the handle is growing around the jewel, I'm going to be cutting multiple strips of 4mm foam and giving them an organic look. These are then glued into place where they're going to wrap around the lower section of the jewel as well as the handle. I'm going to continue to layer these on and then wrap them down towards the base of the handle. I'm not really concerned with what they look like, I'm just trying to bulk it up because a lot of foam clay and sanding is still going to be involved. To reinforce the pieces on the outside of the jewel, I'm going to be cutting part E out of some 4mm foam. Like you've seen me do lots of times, these are going to be glued into place while the foam is bent. That way it's going to retain this curved shape. Part F will be used to make the claws for the guard of the sword. Just like the jewel, 3 pieces of 10mm foam are going to be glued together to get the correct thickness. After all 3 pieces of the 10mm foam have been glued together, then the claw could be cut out. Notice in the video that I also cut a V-groove into the bottom. This is going to allow the claw to better attach to the sword. Going back to my sanding station, I could then start to round over the claws to give it the correct shape. Because the interior claw is a little bit smaller, it's just easier to separate this completely, sand it, and then glue it back on. With the rough shape of the 4 claws blocked out, I could then refine these even further with my rotary tool. Like I had done with the jewel, I'm going to insert some bamboo skewers into the foam. This additional pinning technique will make sure that these claws attach firmly to the sword and won't have any opportunity to be detached. Now to make sure that all of them line up properly, I would recommend to mark placement with a pencil. Needless to say, if one of these is off, it's definitely going to mess with the overall silhouette. And if this sword didn't have enough detail on it, it's now time to cut a bunch of scales out of some 2mm foam. Now your numbers may vary, but I needed approximately 32 of the largest ones and then 64 of each one of the smaller ones for either side. The largest scales, I scored them down the middle to give them a little bit of a bend. I could then start to glue the scales into place, starting on the outside and working my way towards the middle. Then it's just the process of layering the next row down in the exact same way. Now it's time to really bring the sword to life using some foam clay, which is absolutely perfect for organic textures. I start by wetting the foam with some water. This will allow the foam clay to stick to it properly. Then I was able to roll the foam clay into a tube and apply it to the exposed base of the claw. Then I could use additional water, my fingers, and silicone tip tools to press the clay where I wanted it to go. Now if you've never used foam clay before, it is a really fun material to work with, but not all foam clay is made the same. My foam clay has a higher moisture content than any of the others on the market, which gives you better moldability and a longer working time. I of course have links to my HD foam and foam clay down in the video description. Foam clay is also applied to the base of the claw where it attaches to the sword. And this is why I said in the beginning, seams don't really matter because I'm covering up a lot of it with the clay. This texturing process was also applied to the individual sections that were running down the blade. Water is applied to these sections and then small strips of the foam clay can be applied for the textures. And if you notice in the video, it's not really a planned out process. I would recommend to apply clay in between the individual section seams, but other than that, just put some textured clay wherever you think it would look good. After giving the foam clay a chance to skin over for a bit, it's now time to make a bunch of little bulbousy scales by balling up some foam clay and then pressing it onto the surface. And after they were all applied, I could then take a little bit more water on my finger and smooth them over. And it does seem like every little inch of this sword is just absolutely covered with details. But I've got to admit, this is looking pretty awesome. To add additional raised details to the sword, I'm going to be cutting strips of 6mm foam, and notice in the video that they have slight angles on either side. These strips are going to be glued on top of the foam clay using some super glue, and it's going to give a layered look to match the game. And I still can't believe this was only a couple days speed build, but I feel it's one of those things where if you have a con crunch, you don't have time to think about it, you just build. If I had had a month, I guarantee I would have spent a lot more time thinking about placement of every single one of these rather than just getting the work done. These strips are also placed along some of the larger overlapping areas near the top. Now that the strips are attached, I can help further refine their shapes with my rotary tool and make them more sharp. This also gives me the chance to sand away excess material around parts D and E. With the foam at the top of the handle refined, I can now go in with foam clay to make the jewel look more integrated into the handle and to fill in some of the gaps. Now with this process I added more foam clay than necessary because it's always easier to sand it down and get the final shape that I'm looking for. The scales in the claws are a little too smooth, so to add some texture I'm going to be roughing them up with a wire brush. This will help give some striations to the surface so they're not just smooth. And at this point I'm really happy with how the sword is coming out. Because it's only foam, foam clay, and a wooden dowel, it only weighs 2.5 pounds, which is fantastic. A couple layers of plasti dip are applied to seal the sword, and I add some base colors to the blade using some flat antique nickel and khaki. To smooth out the look of the blade, I'm going to be applying some iridescent rich silver from Liquitex. This is applied with a filbert brush along the top of the blade as well as the bevel, and because it's a metallic, no water is added. Now looking at some of the high-res photos, the blade itself has kind of a bluish-green hue, and to achieve this I'm going to be mixing together some paints, some cobalt teal, hooker's green, as well as a Utrecht iridescent tint. The iridescent will kind of give it a shimmer and help thin the paints out, and as you can see here, it's just kind of tinting the surface rather than doing a complete opaque coverage. And of course, when I thought I was almost done, I noticed that the blade has a Damascus pattern, so I added more hooker's green to this mixture, and then painted the Damascus pattern on by hand using a detail brush. And this process was very time consuming, but I will say that it shows up really well in photos. To paint the base of each claw, I'm going to mix together some burnt sienna and raw sienna from Liquitex. This is going to be applied with a mop brush with no water, and is feathered from the base up. I can then switch over to a filbert brush to get the inside of the claws as well. To highlight the top of the claws, I'm going to be using some Liquitex Heavy Body Unbleached Titanium. This is also going to be dry brushed onto the claws, but this time from the top down, feathering the paint. To darken the tips of the claws, a little bit of Heavy Body Mars Black was mixed into the unbleached titanium. This process was repeated again using even more Mars Black and moving closer to the tip of the claws. And for that final touch, I gave him a spray of Valspar Gloss Varnish. Now I can clean up all of the overpaint by adding some Liquitex Mars Black to the scales. This paint is fairly opaque, so it does a really good job covering up the lighter pigments. For the metallic sheen that I want the organic sections to have, I'm going to be using Liquitex Iridescent Rich Silver and Golden Brand Iridescent Bronze. They're first mixed together using more silver, and this is going to be applied to the outside edge of the textured areas. And here you can see having all those textures really allows this dry brush to pop. The paint was also applied to the scales and the handle. And again, I should probably remind you all, because this is metallic, no water is added to the process. For the center of the textured areas, it's primarily the iridescent bronze. Visually, I wanted a color shift from the outside in. This, I think, really helps the blade look a lot more interesting, and it lends to the fact that the blade opens up in the game. To paint the jewel, I'm going to start with a base of Liquitex Aqua Red Orange. Now this paint is not very opaque, but I want that dark red as a base. To this, I'm going to add some cadmium red, which will make it more opaque, and then I can tape off some of the facets. This is going to help give me more of a hard line along the outside edge. And all those years painting jewels on miniatures starts to pay off. To give the jewel a sheen, I'm going to be adding some Deco Art Gloss Varnish. This is applied with a filbert brush across the surface of the entire jewel and just helps tie everything together.
So you all can see what it takes to put together Dante's Devil Sword from Devil May Cry. And if you guys are building any of my builds, especially giant swords like this, definitely tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram, because I love seeing you guys use my templates and referencing my videos. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD Foam.